Here's a hard question to answer. How do you successfully modernize a 30-year-old franchise like Wolfenstein? To update a video game series with such a storied history for new audiences, while at the same time retaining all of the defining traits of what came before? Raven Software struggled with this question when they made Wolfenstein 2009, which I enjoyed well enough but acknowledged didn't completely succeed in preserving and updating the series' lineage. I imagine Machine Games did so as well while they were making Wolfenstein: The New Order. Released in 2014, The New Order is the first game in the franchise to take Wolfenstein out of the Second World War and into a Philip K. Dick-esque alternate history 1960, where the Nazis won the war. With the World War II setting being so integral to the Wolfenstein identity, it was a bold symbolic choice, representing Machine Games' ambition to really bring Wolfenstein to a new generation. A bold attitude can only go so far, however, so the real question to ask is if The New Order succeeds in updating the classic franchise, all the while still undeniably being Wolfenstein. In 2009, a number of members of the video game development team Starbreeze Studios decided to part ways. For those unaware, Starbreeze Studios is a Swedish developer with a prolific resume of different action games, their offerings including the Chronicles of Riddick games, Escape from Butcher Bay and Assault on Dark Athena, The Darkness, and the Syndicate reboot. After 2009, they went on to make Payday 2, and will publish the upcoming Psychonauts 2 and System Shock 3. These 8 departing members included Jens Mathies and Starbreeze founder Magnus Hugdahl, and after this they would go on to form Machine Games. The fresh studio had a rough start, which saw them brainstorm many different game concepts, and then they would go around pitching those to various publishers according to Mathies, and Machine Games would do this for over a year. They were acquired by ZeniMax, and in turn Bethesda, on November 5th, 2010, a little over a year after ZeniMax also bought id Software and all of its intellectual properties. Machine Games pitched a concept to Bethesda, who turned it down and suggested instead that they work on one of id Software's franchises. Members of Machine Games asked if anyone was working on Wolfenstein at that time, which no one was, and thereafter the team got to work on their first full game. Of all the decisions Machine Games made while creating The New Order, it was what they didn't add that may be the most surprising aspect: a complete lack of a multiplayer feature. When asked about this in an interview at QuakeCon 2013, the senior designer at Machine Games gave an interesting answer. For us, it was really easy because we knew what kind of difference it would make to the game. If we could take every bit of energy and sweat the studio has and pour it all into the single-player campaign, it gives us the resources to make something very, very cool, compared to if we would also have to divert some of our resources to making multiplayer. So for us, it was an easy decision that we made pretty much immediately. While the absence of multiplayer may be a letdown for fans of enemy territory, I respect Machine Games for realizing that forcing it in would be stretching their manpower to its very limits. One of the first positive signs of The New Order showing respect for what came before is how the game reintegrated stealth mechanics into the fold, after they were mostly removed from Wolfenstein 2009. Like Return to Castle Wolfenstein, this game tries to somewhat seamlessly mix the fast-paced action of Wolfenstein 3D with the sneaking aspects of the Silas Warner games. Considering how much I blindly praised this merging of genres in the prior game, having it come back in The New Order was a very welcome addition. Like the prior mentioned 2001 release, the stealth in this game is rather basic in comparison to a true blue stealth game. A new addition made to the stealth in The New Order is a pre-rendered knife execution animation, as opposed to doing backstabs manually, since pointing and clicking the mouse with a specific weapon is asking too much of players these days. Yeah, I know it's nitpicking, but this is the kind of thing that really does irritate me in modern games. Maybe it is streamlining for a more convenient user experience, let me know. On the plus side, there is a feature added to the game that does improve the stealth gameplay a good deal, that being the officer mechanic. In nearly every stealth encounter in The New Order, the player has a Nazi officer to become displayed on their HUD, informing them of their general location and direction, who the player is encouraged to take out as quickly as possible. If players fail during stealth and are detected, the officers will sound an alarm from a handheld radio, streams of enemies will pour out endlessly until the officers are killed, and the player will be forced into direct combat. Think of officers like the wall-mounted alarms from Return to Castle Wolfenstein, except mobile and can actually fight back. This is an interesting system to implement to an action-stealth hybrid, because instead of punishing players with a game over, it expects them to demonstrate mastery over the combat mechanics and fight their way to victory. Whether it's by stealth or gunplay, players can only progress by using their proficiency over the mechanics. However, despite all of the good things on display with stealth, there are more issues beyond the small knife quibble from earlier. Namely, the enemy AI is kinda dim. The vision cones seem designed to allow you to stand at 90 degrees to either side of enemies with them still not being able to notice you, so long as you're not shoving your face in their arm. They don't even see you even when they're looking right into Blowjob Blazkowicz's eyes. On top of this, they don't seem to react to seeing bodies of their allies as they pass them by. This flaw aside, the limited stealth in the New Order is actually very enjoyable and acts as a nice complement to the shooting. However, like all of the other Wolfenstein first-person shooters, the gunplay is the real meat of the game. The game has multiple weapons which can be accessed all at once, uses the health and armor system like Return to Castle Wolfenstein, but the player is still vulnerable under fire like they were in Wolfenstein 3D. At least you're vulnerable under fire in the New Order while playing on the Death Incarnate difficulty, which I'd recommend. It's a challenging game, and I'm glad that few punches were pulled in trying to make the difficulty comparable to the older Wolfenstein titles. Getting to the specifics of the gunplay, the on-paper weapon count is low compared to the prior games, technically only having 5, but this fails to illustrate how creative Machine Games got with the arsenal. Most of the guns available to the player have multiple firing modes, some of which essentially act as their own individual weapons. The pistol can have a silencer attached, just as in Return to Castle Wolfenstein. The automatic rifle acts as one would expect, but also doubles as the game's rocket launcher. For the first time ever in the Wolfenstein series, to my recollection, a shotgun is added to the game, and it's a welcome first edition. A close-range powerhouse like in most video games, it dismembers foes in a single blast, has a shrapnel alternate ammo type, which makes quick work of pretty much every enemy in the game, and holds 20 rounds before needing to be reloaded. In short, the thing is a monster. The scoped rifle packs a punch, balanced out by having a low ammo capacity, but the alternate fire acts as a suitable supplement. In essence, it acts as this game's equivalent to the plasma gun from the Doom games, firing blue projectiles quickly, though unlike the Doom 3 variant, it's not reloaded in a traditional sense. I'll touch more on that in a moment. Finally, the player has a railgun of sorts, which while not the gun I had the most fun using, it's easily the most interesting to discuss. The railgun in the New Order acts as a microcosm of the style of progression on display in this game. It starts off as a small handheld welding tool, shortly afterwards becoming a rail handgun, and then after that being traded out for the full railgun around the halfway point. Even after this, however, the progression isn't done. As the player moves forward through the game, they'll come across additional upgrades to improve it. Such upgrades include a reflective shot, a regenerating battery, a scope, and a Tesla gun shot. In a series of linear action games such as the Wolfenstein titles, I much prefer weapon upgrades handled this way. Having the player acquire them all through practically impossible to miss methods allows the developers to create combat encounters with these additional offensive options in mind, which in turn allows for more interesting tests of our grasp of the game's mechanics. I much prefer this method of weapon upgrades over how it was handled in Wolfenstein 2009. On top of an additional knife and EMP grenade options, the player can dual wield all of the guns in the game except for the railgun, which adds an additional offensive ability at the expense of significantly slower movement speed. This segues into my largest issue with the combat, being the player's movement. BJ moves pretty much exactly as he did in Wolfenstein 2009, which means rather slowly, and has the same head-bobbing modern shooter sprint. Having the player's movement be this clunky in a game trying to capture an older run-and-gun vibe is pretty counterintuitive, I'd say, and leaves the pace in the more open combat arenas very slow. The New Order is trying to revamp so much of what was in Return to Castle Wolfenstein, so it's a bit baffling they didn't try to make the player movement more akin to what was in that game. There is a slide move though, which is cool. Despite this low point putting a slight damper on it, the combat is visceral, fast at the best of times, and enjoyable as all hell. I'd recommend the game to a first-person shooter fan for this reason alone. The shooting itself is all well and good, but that's not going to get an action game far if what the player is shooting at isn't up to snuff as well. Fortunately, the rogues in the New Order are a varied enough gallery who put up a decent fight. The Wolfenstein 3D staples of Nazi foot soldiers, dogs, and officers are all back on display. Once again, I'll stop and point out how much the officer alarm mechanic adds to the game. But on top of the Nazis who wield different weapons individually, we have a new armored variant. These walking tanks are similar to the Pyro soldiers from Wolfenstein 2009, as they lumber towards the player, firing everything they have, but the New Order changes up their arsenal. Armored troopers in this game can have either the same shotgun as the player, complete with their own split of buckshot and shrapnel shells, or they can have their own rocket rifles that really put a damper on your day. When these enemies are mixed together with all the others as the game goes on, the gunfights become tense but much more gratifying. Away from the squishy human side and onto the rough mechanical one, there are a few different mech type enemies this time around. The Super Soldier mini-boss from Return to Castle Wolfenstein makes a comeback, looking practically identical to the prior incarnation. Small drone type enemies are one of the new additions to the game, and in essence they're the Wolfenstein variant of the Lost Soul enemy from Doom. They fly around, they shoot you, and you return the sentiment. And two mini-bosses will appear infrequently. A giant robot dog who's fond of rushing the player, and walking mech warriors who feel like much more formidable super soldiers. While not stellar, the New Order has enough variety in its enemies to keep things interesting. There are also a handful of boss fights in the New Order. The London Monitor is a giant tripedal mech and acts as a fairly basic test of the player's ability to shoot at glowing weak points. The brain-powered robot is a cinematic affair that only demands the player to stun it and press a button right up against it. Without spoiling anything, however, it's a more interesting moment in context of the story. However, the final one is clearly the most important, as BJ finally gets to face off against his elusive nemesis Deathset. The first phase of this encounter is a touch on the annoying side, with the only objective being to dodge Deathset's attacks and destroy the two Zeppelins providing him with a shield, which is simple enough. Phase 2 of the fight is where things get more interesting. After falling through the roof and into some pipe-filled industrial chamber, BJ fights Deathset in a battle no doubt calling back to Mecha Hitler from Wolfenstein 3D, the general piloting a mech suit with two chain gun arms. The mech suit is a slow-moving bullet sponge whose sustained fire can wipe the player's health in seconds. Its attacks also destroy what cover the player has, meaning that camping around a corner and getting some shots in here and there won't be effective for very long. However, it can be stunned by rockets or a full Tesla blast. So far, it sounds like just a basic FPS boss fight, nothing special to write home about, but what makes the fight against Mecha Deathset interesting is the arena you fight him in. The room is a small labyrinth of pipes, pillars, and destructible walls, and a walkway to the side of the arena, and what starts off as a fairly basic space for the fight slowly degrades as the encounter continues. The walls are damaged and rendered useless as already mentioned, pipes burst releasing streams of fire, and the visibility of the action gradually decreases due to the smoke and flames. As this occurs during a fight with a rather strong enemy, it tests your ability to shoot at targets, avoid getting shot yourself, improvise to new hazards on the fly, and navigate dangerous environments all at once. It's not necessarily an amazing boss fight or anything, but Mecha Deathset is better than most first-person shooter bosses, and is easily the most enjoyable one in any of the Wolfensteins. Don't think it's all just a slick variant on what came before, because the New Order has some relatively unique mechanics of its own to set it out from the rest of the series. While it does have a health and armor system, the version of the health bar here is unlike any other that springs to my mind. See, it acts like a standard health bar, a number that gets replenished from static items found within the level, but there's a twist to it. It also features a limited regenerating health. No matter what, the player health in the New Order always regenerates to the nearest 20th. If the player has 68, for instance, it'll regen to 80. It's such a minor addition that I wonder why it's even present. I'm genuinely baffled by it. I can't think of a reason as to why machine games would include it. Whatever the reason, I'm not a fan. Another feature I don't particularly care for is the perk system in place, which encourages players to complete certain challenges to unlock extra abilities during gameplay. I'd prefer having all of these abilities from the get-go for reasons I outlined both earlier and in my review of Wolfenstein 2009, but I don't think the perks are all that useful to intentionally aim for. In my most recent run of the New Order, I ignored them completely and my experience was not negatively impacted in any way by doing so. Talking about the technical side of things for a second, it's worth noting that the New Order does unfortunately run on id Tech 5, an engine with a less than stellar reputation. While the game looks good, mostly due to a solid art direction and animations, there's pop-in galore, somewhat long loading times, and the jarring transitions from cutscene to gameplay. One thing I do want to say about the visuals is how nuts the blood splatters are for the human enemies when they get shot. While the game may be lacking in gore, the amount of blood on display is pretty extreme. Even body shots on enemies can result in it looking like water balloons of cherry Kool-Aid popping off on their bodies. It makes a great visual indication that you're actually hitting enemies and doing damage, and it makes the game more visceral without it becoming anything realistically violent. It reminds me of how blood would pop off of enemies in Bloodborne. It looks stylish and makes the impact satisfying. A similar thing is done with the mechanical enemies, who have bright orange sparks coming off them when the player is doing damage. The audio in the game fares very well in its own right, the soundtrack for instance being composed by Mick Gordon. In what feels like a very short span of time, Mick Gordon has become one of the most prolific video game composers working today, creating the music for Killer Instinct 2013, Doom 2016, and Prey 2017. I really hate these reboot titles. His work in the New Order? It's alright. I'm not gonna lie, while I enjoy myself some synth music, I can't help but feel that a good chunk of the synth soundtrack in this game is completely out of place for Wolfenstein. In context of the actual gameplay, it works well enough, and a couple of the tracks are great at setting an atmosphere. But the heavy synthesizer tracks are no doubt an odd choice for an alternate history game set in 1960. Not a bad choice, mind you, it's just an odd one. I really do enjoy the Nazi world pop songs, on the other hand. They're a small addition to the game, but they do add a lot to the world building, showing something as basic as pop music in this dystopia. The sound design is in general very nice, a particular standout for me being how the Nazis speak actual German for the first time in a Wolfenstein game. Not just things like, "Mein Leben," either, full conversations in German. It goes a long way to immerse you in the world of the New Order, if you excuse my pretentious language there. Speaking about speaking, let's talk about the voice cast of the game because it's a really good one. Every character, no matter how major or minor, sounds either like a real human being or enjoyably memorable, and occasionally the voice actors can manage both. Even something as minor as random enemy chatter is entertaining, a notable highlight being the mold discussion in the prison. One thing I appreciated in the voice cast is how they casted actors who actually matched the rough background of their character's nationality. For American characters, they cast American actors. For the Polish Anya, they cast a Polish actress. For the German and otherwise Western European characters, they got German and Western European actors, albeit with one major exception, and so on. It's a nice touch that you don't see all too often in video games. Without getting into the specifics as to why, there are 3 vocal performances that really stood out to me. Brian Bloom as BJ Blazkowicz, Dwight Schultz as Willem Deathset Strauss, and Nina Franzek as Frau Engel. Before discussing the story and characters in general, I just want to reiterate, the voice cast is great. I don't think anyone can argue how the biggest changes that the New Order makes to the Wolfenstein formula are the setting and the increased emphasis on narrative. It's a conclusion to the trilogy set up in 2001, consisting of Return to Castle Wolfenstein and Wolfenstein 2009, all focusing around BJ's fight against Deathset. The story here begins in 1946 in a world where the Second World War never ended, the Nazi war machine's stronger than ever, and the Allies and BJ are going on one last assault against the General. This inevitably fails, the player is forced into a moral choice situation, and during an escape, BJ is injured, falling comatose. 14 years pass, and after one hell of a rude awakening, he springs to life once more in the year 1960, with the majority of the world ruled by the Third Reich. After some hijinks involving torture and a prison escape, BJ rejoins the German-based Kreisau Circle from Wolfenstein 2009 and begins fighting once again. I like the setting of the New Order. It's somewhat unique, provides some interesting visual designs and art direction, it has some decent world building through small details like the newspaper clippings, which makes for a neat alternate history science fiction world, and the plot setup of being a resistance fighter fighting a global empire allows for some interesting locale variety. The New Order is a globe-trotting adventure like Return to Castle Wolfenstein that sees players head through Germany, Poland, England, the moon, and so on. As we discussed during the voice actor section, the cast of characters is enjoyable, ranging from likable to fun. Even the most minor of characters have some decent traits, which will leave them an impression on the player, and the writing is decent enough to make listening in on conversations pleasant. Also, as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 members of the cast who really stand out. And we'll start with the de facto main villain of the Wolfenstein series. Deathset is given more characterization here than in any of the other games, but unlike his depiction in 2009, he's consistent with what little we got in Return to Castle Wolfenstein. He's a man of science, first and foremost, the ridiculous Wolfenstein super science anyway, who takes great pride in his creations. Machine Games expanded on this concept much further by portraying Deathset in the New Order as a borderline geriatric sadist, who takes almost sexual pleasure in his work. He dissects his victims with glee, practically tripping over his words while describing the physical features of BJ's allies, their eyes specifically. His sadism isn't all that there is to the guy, however, because his pride extends beyond his work and onto the Third Reich as a whole. He's simply in love with the world the Nazis have created, a true believer to his core, and his disdain for Blazkowicz comes from what he sees as BJ's pointless insolence. After all, the Kreisau Circle seems to be the only resistance force in Europe left, which from Deathhead's warped perspective would make them the peace-disrupting terrorists, trying to destroy what the Reich had spent so long creating. He says this as much during the final mission, BJ's last raid on his compound, with numerous speeches about how useless and needlessly destructive the Kreisau Circle's efforts really are. One quote in particular always stuck out to me. Deathhead says to BJ over the PA system, Your legacy is nothing but a common impulse of anger, no different from the gorilla in the jungle beating his chest, and even less impressive. In this sense, he reminds me of Dr. Breen from Half-Life 2, similar to Breen's quote to Gordon Freeman.
Tell me, Dr. Freeman, if you can. You have destroyed so much. What is it exactly that you have created? Can you name even one thing? I thought not.
The difference here is that while Breen's motivations can be debated back and forth, Deathset's cannot. He genuinely believes in the Nazis and loves what they've done. A little less clear on her personal love for the Third Reich is the officer Frau Engel, though what is apparent is her complete lack of empathy. To put it simply, Frau is a very bad woman. Throughout the game, the player will see her casually joking about war atrocities she's committed, gleefully watch over a forced labor camp, not to mention both pulling a baby away from a prisoner's arms only to beat it immediately afterwards, conduct raids and executions without any remorse, and do it all with a self-assured sense of smug the entire time, her boy toy booby on her arms at almost every moment. Actually, it's that word I used to describe Frau more than anything, and it's something few other villains have captured perfectly: smug. Whether or not Frau is a true believer in the Nazis is irrelevant, because she's more than happy to give them her all so long as they allow her to indulge her near unyielding cruelty. And it's this cruelty that more than likely gave Frau the position of power she holds. And for fun, I personally like to imagine that Frau is a retired member of the Elite Guard. What did surprise me upon first playing the New Order is how the character I found to be the most compelling was actually BJ Blazkowicz. This might take some people back, considering that in my last review I state how I preferred BJ Blazkowicz when he was silent in 3D and Return to Castle Wolfenstein over his vocal 2009 incarnation. However, what really set this version apart for me was that Machine Games really took the time to take that aforementioned silent depiction of the character and use it as the basis for their own interpretation. In short, BJ from the New Order feels like what the mute version of the character would have been like had he been able to speak. He looks like a fully realized version of his Wolfenstein 3D sprite, and the detail of his character that I mentioned in my Return to Castle Wolfenstein review may be what Machine Games used as the foundation for what they want to do with the character. BJ Blazkowicz is a man who is good at one thing, and one thing only: destruction, whether it be destroying objects or by killing a person. As a first-person shooter protagonist, it's not surprising that BJ is very skilled at shooting things until they die. But what sets him apart from others is that it's more than likely that he is only good at killing Nazis and destroying things. Throughout the New Order, the player will see BJ try and fail to make coffee, use tools, be a diplomat, comfort his friend, do basic electrician work, free prisoners, and so on. It's not for a lack of trying on his part, it just seems that no matter what he tries to do beyond the one thing he does best, BJ's just really poor at it. For lack of a better expression, it honestly seems like BJ Blazkowicz was born to kill. In Blazkowicz's defense, it's not as if he's a malevolent figure. He is trying to rid the world of a totalitarian empire, but the core point still stands. Killing is all that there is to him. Just a quick warning, here's where I get really pretentious. In a meta-narrative sense, BJ Blazkowicz is living through the horror that being player 1 in a first-person shooter would be, as no matter if he wants to fight or not, he's trapped in the role. He will fight, shoot, and kill until he dies, in our context until they stop making Wolfenstein games, no matter what future he may want for himself. BJ may want a wife, kids, white picket fenced house, the whole idealized American dream, but he'll never have that because he's the first-person shooter protagonist man. The exchange between him and his love interest Anya in the game's finale, before he goes to face down Deathset one last time, I think illustrates this best. The world BJ wants is one that, if he did live to see it, would have absolutely no place for a man like him. It's why I personally think that he should have died at the end of the New Order, as him sacrificing himself almost needlessly after killing Deathset would have hammered this point home further. It even seemed like this was the actual ending, but as we see in the new Colossus, the upcoming sequel, BJ lived and will continue to shoot the gun at the guys. However he's portrayed in the new Colossus will have no real bearing on his depiction in the New Order, which in my opinion is a very good one. Easily the best voiced variant of a previously silent character in any video game. When it comes to the story of the New Order, there is an elephant in the room. One large, very critical error that's a make or break for people when trying to come to a conclusion on the game's quality. Despite my positive opinions on the plot, characters, and world, Even I can't deny the game has poor pacing. In this context, I use pacing to describe the ratio of gameplay to cutscenes. Cutscene describing both pre-rendered animations and the limited interactive segments. As I said, the New Order is a very story-heavy game, and this results in the extended gameplay sequence frequently being brought to a halt by the aforementioned pre-rendered and interactive cutscenes. This issue can be seen from the game's introduction in the turret sequence all the way to the very end. Not 20 minutes go by most of the time without the game interrupting your play in some way. Finally getting into the groove of the gameplay? Cutscene. Just finished a boss fight? Cutscene. Finished a mission? Interactive in-game cutscene. It's like this for the entire game, and it never gets any more tolerable beyond your first playthrough, and that's assuming you have investment in the story to begin with. The most aggressive offender for this kind of pace-breaking narrative is the Kreisau Circle's home base, which is sort of like the miniature hub of the game. After every mission following the prison break, you'll return to the hub after every level to do odd jobs around the base for members of the resistance group before you can tackle a main mission again. For a first playthrough, assuming you care, this is all well and good for developing the cast and the world they live in, but on repeat runs, this is incredibly tedious. When you just want to play through the game and enjoy the stealth and gunplay, you have to put up with not only the cutscenes and the interactive cutscenes during the missions, but the little fetch quests in the hub as well. The worst part is that there's an easy fix to this issue that will be both consistent with the game's characterization of BJ and be beneficial to the player who just wants to avoid the story. Make the Kreisau Circle fetch quests optional. If the player does them, it's because BJ in that playthrough is trying to build stronger ties to his allies and attempting to become something more than just a killer. If the player skips these sections, it's because BJ wants to rid the world of the Nazis as fast as he can, and that's because he's aware that killing them is what he does better than anything else. It adds a neat layer to BJ's character arc and helps players on replays get back to the action faster. Even as I say this, however, I also realize that a lot of the narrative strength in the New Order requires the Kreisau Circle segments to be played, so I could be completely off base with this suggestion. The reason that these Kreisau Circle segments are a touch on the annoying side is because of how frequent the interruptions are during the missions. Some of the cutscenes would have been just better off as radio conversations played over the gameplay, and certain segments during the missions are absolute pace breakers. The two standouts in this regard are the swim to the submarine, which has one enjoyable fight sequence preceded by a rather boring sewer swim, and the labor camp mission. Now, I do respect machine games for not trying to shy away from things such as concentration camps during their campy Nazi alternate history shooter, but the actual chapter itself is a slog to play through. The first third is a series of those aforementioned interactive cutscenes. The second third is a poor excuse for a stealth segment, which has basically no real punishment for failure unlike regular stealth segments. And the final third is a small mech piloting bit where BJ wrecks the camp with one and frees the prisoners incarcerated with him. It's a fun little segment, but it's not exactly a challenging one, and on the whole the entire camp is a mission which feels like a chore on repeat playthroughs. It's not an exaggeration to say that the gameplay to cutscene pacing is among the worst missteps machine games made with the New Order. And no matter how much fun I can have with the game, this aspect always makes me question myself before doing a replay. If this killed the game for you and you just cannot enjoy it because of this, that is perfectly reasonable. There's also one other aspect to the story that plays into the game's mechanics, that being the timeline system. At the beginning of the game, Deathset forces BJ to choose between sacrificing one of his two allies, Fergus or Wyatt, and this choice will influence a few small things. It'll change which of the two will be a member of the Kreisau Circle in 1960, if the player can either pick locks or hotwire, and what the player will have upgraded through the game. The hotwire and lockpicking differences alter the player's path through the mission slightly, and the upgrade changes a choice if the player gets a larger health pool or stronger armor. Pick the Fergus timeline, you'll hotwire and get more health. Pick the Wyatt timeline, you'll get armor upgrades and learn how to lockpick. These are both very small changes, but I do appreciate the effort to add some replay value. When it was first released, critics and players were pleasantly surprised by Wolfenstein: The New Order, considering that few people had any faith in the project to succeed. It might have been this low expectation which caused people at the time to overlook the game's issues, because while I do enjoy the New Order a good deal, it's a very flawed experience. The actual gameplay, being the gunplay and stealth, is pretty much stellar, but the constant interruptions bring a damper on the entire experience. What you're interrupted by is what I personally find to be a well-told, acted, and developed story, but if it's something that you're not into, it's only going to serve to irritate you. The New Order, at the end of the day, did rekindle public interest in the Wolfenstein series, and Machine Games proved that they had what it takes to keep the legacy going. Unfortunately, it's one that does have its fair share of issues.